asked about some of the most influential consoles in gaming history, your mind may jump to the original PlayStation or perhaps Nintendo's first ever console, the NES. But when I think influential gaming, something a little more fuzzy and blue comes to mind. You know what's coming next? We're talking the history of Sega. I'm Alli Embers, and you're watching All In. Before we get into all the details of the more modern Sega legacy, let's first look at the company's original inception. The formation of the company Sega, which we know to be a Japanese multinational game developer and publisher, didn't actually get their start in Japan at all. Its predecessor companies actually date all the way back to the 1930s. Jewish-American businessman Irving Bromberg had been a major player in the coin-operated distribution business ever since establishing the Irving Bromberg Company in New York, 1931. In 1940, seeing an increase in military personnel having demand for leisure activity during World War II, Bromberg, his son, and a family friend formed Standard Games in Honolulu, Hawaii, where they provided coin-operated amusement machines to military bases. Over the next few years, they would expand the business and change their name several times before eventually landing on Service Games. In 1951, the Transportation of Gambling Devices Act outlawed slot machines in U.S. territories, so naturally, Bromberg sent 2 employees outside the U.S. to Tokyo, Japan, to establish a new distributor, which would be called Service Games of Japan. The company was very successful, and over the next decade, they expanded and eventually sold the company, which ultimately was split up into 2 separate entities. Finally, in 1964, these 2 companies merged and sought out partnership with David Rosen of Sega Enterprises, who had also made a name for himself in the coin-operated games industry. They joined forces, and thus, Sega Enterprises was born. Sega! So, now you know where the name comes from, the first 2 letters of the word service and games. Over the next couple decades, Sega had some pretty major success selling and licensing pinball machines and arcade games up until the early 80s. It was around this time that Sega decided to enter the home console market. In July of 1983, Sega launched its first ever console, the SG-1000. This ROM cartridge-based system never left Japan and unfortunately was overshadowed by Nintendo's Famicom. However, it was a hefty step in the right direction, aiding in that arcade game to home console industry transition. Sega's next console was the Master System. Released in 1985, this was Sega's first worldwide launch, but sadly, the system just couldn't keep up and undersold again due to the success of Nintendo's NES, previously sold as the Famicom or Family Computer in Japan. Nintendo had built such a massive empire that the idea of beating them, let alone equally matching them in the consumer market, seemed almost impossible. It was here when Sega's president and CEO Hayao Nakayama tracked down and recruited former Mattel Toys executive Tom Kalinske, who coincidentally was on vacation with his family in, get this, Hawaii, which, if you remember, is where Sega got its start as Standard Games over 40 years prior. Small world. Nakayama approached Kalinske with the secret weapon in taking down Nintendo, the Sega Genesis system with 16-bit technology. This was unprecedented in the game world. After all, compared to Nintendo's 8-bit technology, it was lightning fast and graphically dominant. In awe, Kalinske agreed to become the CEO of Sega America, where he began planning his strategies for taking on Nintendo in what he described would be a war.
What Nintendo?
After all, 16-bit technology was amazing, but they still needed something that would undoubtedly end Nintendo's reign. Competitive pricing and a new hit game that could outsell Mario would be crucial, but what no one was expecting was for Sega to target an entirely new age demographic. Up until this point, video games were sold exclusively with the idea of young children in mind. Marketing towards teens would be risky, but they would have more to lose if they weren't innovative here. It was literally a go big or go home situation. In the meantime, game developer Hirokazu Yasuhara was looking for something that would appeal to an American audience. He found inspiration in theme park roller coasters, and since the Genesis could already render loops and turns, it was a perfect fit. Game designer Nato Oshima had begun creating a mascot for the game with the hopes of finally being able to dethrone Mario. Some of the early ideas consisted of a rabbit and a panda, before finally landing on a hedgehog. Named after his abilities of super speed, in 1991, Sonic the Hedgehog was born.
Sonic the Hedgehog!
Collect Collectively, Sega's Sonic, sports games, 16-bit gameplay, and the Genesis does what Nintendo don't attitude gave Nintendo a run for their money. And for a while, Sega was dominating. It was a household name craze. Sega rode this success until 1995 with the release of their next console in the US, the Sega Saturn.
Look for Sega Saturn. It's out there.
Regrettably, they did launch and price it too high, so it tanked next to Sony's PlayStation and the Nintendo 64. With one last push to dominate the home console market, in 1999, Sega launched the esteemed 128-bit Sega Dreamcast, beating Sony's PS2 and Microsoft's Xbox to market. The console was really ahead of its time and to this day remains a fan favorite. It did sell over 9 million units and introduced series like Shenmue, Soul Calibur, and Crazy Taxi. Sadly, it just wasn't enough to keep up with the PS2, and just 2 years after its launch was discontinued in North America. This ultimately led to Sega leaving the console business. Back to present day, Sega is far from gone. It's still a major game publisher, and for the last 2 decades it's focused on games for other platforms. Some of their more recent titles have been the Yakuza series, Bayonetta, the Total War series, and, of course, Sonic games. Not bad for a little coin-operated company that started in the 1930s. I'm really interested to see where the future of Sega takes us, and who knows, Sega could be hiding some crazy new game technology and change the gaming world as we know it. Again. Well, that's all I have for you guys this time. Be sure to stop by my Instagram and my Twitch at Alli Embers, where we can chat about all things game. See you next time!